Latino students, underperformance, and the dropout rate. For years, it has been blamed on money, on certification of teachers, whether they've been trained well enough, bilingual education, and other problems, such as overcrowded classrooms. Well, now another idea, a radical idea, being proposed by our next guest. His name is Ernesto Caravantes, and his book is called Clipping Their Own Wings, The Incompatibility Between Latino Culture and American Education. Mr. Caravantes, an educator himself. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
What's the premise of this book?
Well, the basic premise of my book is that every culture has a list of what they consider to be most and least important in that culture, that which they value, that which they have honored for hundreds of years. And so basically what I decided to do was write about the Latino culture as it exists here in the United States, and to point out the fact that they have been valuing other things such as family unity, sending money back home, keeping their kids close to the family, keeping the family unit intact, and they're putting those things above education. In other words, education is not as important to them as these other matters. But of course, there are ramifications to that.
Why is it that you argue that they don't value education enough?
I think that on a basic level, for a lot of the parents that we have here in the Southland, they might have come from Mexico to the United States with, let's say, a 7th, 8th grade education, if that. So if you ask them, do you want your child to go off and get a good education, they might very well say, and very honestly say, yes, I do. I honestly want my child to get a better education than I had. They may not have the requisite experience coming from a rural, town in Mexico to have the actual knowledge of what it is they need to know. SAT scores, ACT scores, college application essays, talking to college counselors, talking to high school counselors, going to the parent-teacher meetings at their child's school. So they might have a very basic and rather honest wish to see their child get a good education, but they may not have the actual concrete knowledge of what they actually have to do to send their child off to a university.
But they come from countries or cultures where there's a subsistence level, a standard by which they don't see many examples, for example, in Mexico, of an upward mobility through education. Is that your point?
Well, my point is that you're right. They do come from a background where it is a subsistence standard of living, and they don't have the requisite information back home. But there are so many countless ways that parents in both English and Spanish, and so many other languages now, can learn about the college and university system. I mean, you walk into any bookstore, and right there you can see the U.S. News and World Report college ranking systems.
Right, but if they don't have an experience within their own culture before they come to the United States of using education as a ladder for their children, they haven't seen much examples of that in their own country. Why would they bring it over here if they have no touchstone from the very beginning?
Well, that's why there has to be a shift in values. Upon the process of immigrating to this country, they have to realize that what may or may not have worked back home has to be a little bit different here. That in this country, in order to get ahead, a young person has to have a college degree just to get their foot in the door. So they have to learn. In a sense, it becomes an education about an education. I mean, they have to sort of educate themselves about how education works here in the United States.
Is this being articulated anywhere else? I mean, is this dialogue taking place?
I'm starting to finally get a little bit more dialogue opened up. I've had some newspaper articles written about it, some radio interviews being done. Finally, I think the word is getting around that perhaps culture may not be the very thing that we should honor, but without recognizing at least some of the negative aspects of it.
In terms of the language barrier, how does that play a role in all this?
Well, I have spoken to numerous teachers and educators who say that the Latino parents shy away from coming to school events, meetings, and so on because they feel that they wouldn't be able to communicate with the teachers and staff and the counselors, so they shy away. So I think there has to be perhaps a greater recognition of how we can get Latino parents who may not have the English skills to come to these events, maybe with translators. Perhaps some of the literature could be in both languages, just to have that open invitation and get them to come. Because many of the Latino parents feel that their only job, their only responsibility is to drop their child off in the morning at school and then pick them up in the afternoon, and that their job is done. And here in the United States, of course, parents have to be very proactive and have to take a very active role in that process.
Why did you write this book?
I felt that of all the research that I'd been doing ever since I got my master's degree, no one was addressing the aspect of culture. That, as you mentioned, other things were being mentioned. Were teachers being trained well enough? Were they being certified? Did the certification programs at the universities where these teachers were coming out have to be revamped? Was it economics? And I felt that coming from myself, my own Mexican family, my own Mexican heritage, and having studied so many countless other Latino families and having read so much of the literature on the Latino culture, that culture itself could be a liability as well as an asset. You know, when I was in college, it was pounded into our brains that culture was something to be celebrated, something that we should honor, something that we should get in touch with and get in touch with our roots. And I think that's important. I think there's some merit and some truth to that. But what the university departments are not perhaps fully fleshing out in their curriculum is the fact that there can be a downside to culture. There can be negative aspects of culture. Culture can be just as much a liability as an asset.
This is the largest ethnic group, the only ethnic group we've ever had in the United States where there was such an infrastructure for the language that they bring over, that there may not be that demand to learn the new language. Have you seen that?
Absolutely. I mean, in numerous cities throughout the Southland, you know, one can drive through and one feels as if one is in Mexico or one is in, you know, Central America. And it's unfortunate because these enclaves are created. And just like you said, they have all their needs met. The bank, the pharmacy, you know, the local stores, the grocery stores, everything is provided in their language.
Does that conspire in an educational framework?
It does, ultimately, because if they're not learning English, I mean, if they're not learning the language, you know, once a child goes off to a university, the textbooks are going to be in English, the lectures are going to be in English, all the curriculum is going to be in English. So ultimately, they have to break out of that if they're going to get ahead.
Did you speak Spanish or English when you were growing up?
You know, it's interesting, and I spoke a lot about this because it was such a heavy-duty experience for me. When I was in the first and second grade, I spoke mostly Spanish and did not speak hardly a word of English. And I still remember to this day, you know, nearly flunking out of school because I did not know the language, the English language, as I needed to. I was not picking it up. And finally, my second grade teacher had a conference with my mom and said, look, you either teach Ernesto English or go back to Mexico. I had the good fortune of having bilingual parents who were fully bilingual, could speak to me in English. And from that day on, they changed everything, 180 degrees. Everything at home from then on was in English. But I was fortunate, and not a lot of Hispanics have that luxury.
What are you hoping for with this book?
What I would like to do is to open up a discussion with teachers, with educators and counselors, people who service the Hispanic population in the United States so they can understand perhaps a little bit further and a bit more clearly why this phenomenon of the dropout rate is occurring.
Ernesto Caravantes, Clipping Their Own Wings, the incompatibility between Latino culture and American education. Somewhat controversial. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Up next on News Conference, a conversation with famed homicide detective Ray Peavy from the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department. That when News Conference returns.